The house was never just a house to me. Its walls carried laughter from birthdays long gone. Its creaking staircase remembered the hurried steps of children rushing to school, and the gardenia, though overrun with weeds, now still whispered with the voices of evenings when my parents sat on the porch and spoke about life in hushed, hopeful tones. It wasn't perfect. The paint peeled in corners. The roof complained whenever the rains arrived, and the heating groaned each winter as though reminding us it was older than any of us, but it was ours. More than that, it was many the anchor that kept me standing when everything else around me seemed determined to collapse. So when the debt notices came, when the red-inked threats from the bank began to pile up like a storm on my kitchen table, I felt my chest cave in. Losing the house wasn't just about losing shelter, it was about losing memory, losing identity, losing the very proof that our family had once been whole. The numbers were brutal, cold. I sat with spreadsheets, bills, and letters scattered across the floor like broken glass, every figure cut deeper. The debt wasn't small. It wasn't something I could ignore and hope would go away. It had the kind of weight that pulled at your shoulders even while you slept, the kind of shadow that crept into every dream and left you waking up gasping for air. My family knew. They pretended to worry with me, long sighs at the dinner table, sympathetic shakes of the head, empty promises of "we'll figure this out." But I noticed how quickly their voices trailed off, how their eyes darted away when the real numbers were spoken aloud. The truth was, I was alone in this, and so I made the decision no one else dared to. I would cover the debt. It meant emptying my savings, the account I had quietly built over years of skipped luxuries, extra shifts, and silent sacrifices. It meant letting go of the dream I had nursed to finally travel, to finally invest in myself. It meant trading freedom for stability, my future for our present. The night I signed the papers and transferred the money, I cried, not just because of the amount, but because of the silence in which I had to do it. Not a single hand reached to help me steady the pen. Not a single voice told me I wasn't crazy for burning away so much of my life's work on these walls. Still, when the transaction cleared, when the bank confirmed that the foreclosure was halted, I let myself breathe for the first time in months. I walked through the rooms of the house with trembling hands, touching the wallpaper, the furniture, even the cracked kitchen tiles. I told myself it was worth it, that I had saved us. That night, I sat in the living room with a mug of tea gone cold, staring at the family photographs lining the mantle. I thought of everything I had given up for this moment. My heart ached, but it was a sweet ache, the kind that comes from sacrifice made for love. Tomorrow, I told myself, they would understand. Tomorrow, they would see what I had done. Tomorrow, maybe, they would finally look at me with something other than expectation. I fell asleep in that chair, the documents stacked neatly beside me like a promise. But tomorrow was waiting with a betrayal I could not yet imagine. The first light of morning spilled lazily across the curtains, painting the room in gold. For a brief, fragile moment, I forgot the weight of everything. My chest felt lighter, almost proud, knowing I had done the impossible. I had saved our home. But pride is a fragile thing. It can shatter before you even realize you're holding it. I reached for the documents I had left on the table the night before, wanting to see them again, as if the ink could reassure me that it hadn't been a dream. The papers were gone. At first, I thought maybe someone had put them away. Maybe, just maybe, my family had finally woken up to the magnitude of what I had done and carefully tucked the files somewhere safe. That hopeful thought lasted all of 5 seconds, because then I saw it. A folded sheet of paper sat on the mantle, right where the photographs of our family had once stood proudly together. My hand trembled as I picked it up, recognizing the rushed handwriting. The words were short, cutting, merciless. "We sold the house. It's done. Don't be angry, we needed the money. You'll understand one day." That was it. No signature, no explanation, no apology. The air left my lungs like I had been struck in the chest. My knees buckled, and I dropped onto the couch, the note clutched so tightly in my fist it crumpled into a ball. My ears rang with silence, and no footsteps upstairs, no clatter in the kitchen, no voices calling my name. The house, once so full, was empty. They were gone. I rushed through the rooms like a madman, throwing open doors, yanking back curtains, calling out until my voice broke. Nothing. Closets were stripped, drawers emptied, the faint smell of packed bags lingering in the hallway. They hadn't just sold the house, they had abandoned me in it. The betrayal was so sharp it felt physical. I pressed my palms against the walls as though the plaster itself could explain, as though the house I had saved could tell me why its very heart had been sold without my consent. My chest burned with questions that had no answers. Why would they do this? After I gave everything, after I sacrificed so much, why wasn't I worth even a conversation, a warning, a moment of honesty? Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled into the kitchen. The mug of tea I had left the night before still sat on the counter, cold and untouched, mocking me with the comfort I thought I had earned. I thought of the nights I had gone without meals to save money, the hours of overtime I had endured, the quiet, grinding exhaustion that had built the savings I had just poured into this house. I thought of the promises whispered to me in moments of weakness: we're in this together. Lies. All of them. The silence of the house was deafening now. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like laughter behind my back. Every shadow in the hallway felt like it was pointing a finger at my stupidity. I wasn't their savior. I was their fool. I collapsed onto the living room floor and let the sobs come, raw and broken. The walls heard it all, soaking in my pain like they had once soaked in our laughter. But even they could not comfort me. They were no longer mine, no longer ours. They belonged to someone else now, us strangers who would never know the price I paid to keep them standing. And somewhere out there, the people I had sacrificed everything for were counting their profit, free of the burden I had carried alone. I had saved the house. And by morning, I had lost everything. The days that followed blurred into one another, like smudged ink on paper. I woke each morning expecting the house to still be mine, only to remember, sometimes in a rush of panic, sometimes in a dull ache, that it wasn't. The silence was unbearable. The echo of my footsteps in hollow rooms felt like mockery. Every corner of the house whispered memories, but they no longer belonged to me. They belonged to people who had walked away, leaving me with nothing but ashes. At first, I begged myself to understand them. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were desperate. Maybe they thought selling was the only way out. Maybe they didn't mean to hurt me the way they did. But each time I reached for an excuse, the reality came crashing back. They hadn't told me. They hadn't trusted me. They hadn't even asked. Instead, they had left me a note. Cold, final, and cowardly. Nights were the worst. I lay awake on the bare mattress, staring at the ceiling, replaying every sacrifice I had made, every skipped meal, every unpaid luxury, every overtime shift that had drained the life from me. I remembered the ache in my bones, the weight in my chest, the constant fear of losing the home. I remembered the trembling relief when I paid the debt, believing foolishly that it meant safety for all of us. And I remembered their words. Don't be angry, we needed the money. Not once did they mention me. Not once did they acknowledge what I had given up. I wasn't family. I was a resource, a wallet to be emptied, a fool to be used, a sacrifice to be discarded. That thought burned deeper than any grief. Somewhere in that pit of sorrow, something inside me shifted. My tears dried. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had changed shape. It became heat, a smoldering fire in my chest. I stopped asking why. I stopped begging the walls for answers they could never give me. I knew now what I had been to them: convenient, disposable. And if that was how they saw me, then they would learn the cost of underestimating me. I began to dig. The house had been sold quickly, too quickly for it to have been a sudden decision. That meant they had been planning it all along, even while I was emptying my savings to cover the debt. Every sympathetic sigh, every "we'll figure this out," every nod at the dinner table had been part of their act, a smokescreen to keep me blind. I pulled records, contacted the bank, searched property databases late into the night. Each new discovery was a knife in my gut. The sale hadn't been a desperate scramble, it had been calculated, arranged, and executed with precision. They had signed papers behind my back, profited from my sacrifice, and walked away with pockets full of the money I thought had saved us. And the cruelest part? They hadn't disappeared into the wind. They were out there, living, laughing, spending. I saw traces of them on social media: new clothes, new trips, new smiles plastered across faces that had once sat across from me at the dinner table. The betrayal was complete, but so was my resolve. I swore then, in the dead of night with nothing but bitterness for company, that I would not let this end here. They thought I was weak because I gave. They thought I was blind because I trusted, but I wasn't weak anymore. And I wasn't blind. I would find a way. I would make them see me, and I would make them regret ever underestimating the value of the very person who had saved them. For now, I kept quiet. I let the fire grow, hidden beneath the ashes. They had struck first. They thought they had won. But the sweetest revenge is patient, and mine was just beginning to take shape. The fire I had nurtured beneath the ashes did not roar all at once. It was methodical, quiet steps, small victories, the accumulation of tiny cuts until the wound finally bled open. Revenge, I learned, was less about spectacle and more about patience. It was about stacking facts like bricks until there was no roof left for the betrayers to hide under. First, I gathered proof. Not because I wanted to punish blindly, but because truth is a weapon that leaves no stains on the hands that wield it. I found the contract the buyer had signed, the bank transfer receipts that matched the dates, messages that betrayed hurry and collusion. I printed names and dates, photographed documents with a trembling hand, recorded old voicemails where promises hung like loose threads. Each piece fit into a mosaic of calculated deceit. I went to the law. A small woman with steel behind her soft voice, who listened without blinking as I laid everything on her desk. She didn't offer platitudes. She offered strategy. "We don't win on outrage," she said, tapping the paper with a measured finger. "We win on evidence, on the procedure, on where the law and their conscience intersect. If they forged signatures, hid assets, or moved money improperly, there are holes. If they profited unjustly, we make them return it. And if they lied to a court or the bank, we expose it where it cannot be ignored." Her words steadied the trembling I hadn't known I still had. We filed notices, requests for audit, and formal complaints. It felt clinical and petty at times, paperwork and photocopies in exchange for the flood of old emotions. But the machine of justice, even when slow, has teeth. I learned how to read the ledger of their lies and where their arrogance had left breadcrumbs. I did not shout from rooftops. I let whispers grow into murmurs. I contacted an old neighbor who had once been friendly with them, the neighbor whose attentiveness had always annoyed the family. She had noticed late-night conversations, envelopes exchanged in the car, a moving truck parked for one dreadful dawn. She had little to say at first, but after a few cups of tea and a steadying of my resolve, she handed me names and a witness statement with shaking hands. Word spread not as rumor but as corroboration. The realtor who had handled the sale began to fidget when I called. Evasive on the first two rings and curt on the third. When confronted with questions about unexplained discounts, odd clauses in the sale agreement, and receipts for cash withdrawals that matched the timeline, his smoothness cracked. He started returning calls at odd hours, offering apologies that tasted of fear. The people who had once laughed around our battered dining table felt the ground shift under their own feet. They had assumed that enough distance and a few laughs on social media would bury the past. Instead, invitations began to evaporate. Friends with who had once toasted with them now glanced at them like strangers. Employment opportunities cooled. The local market, a small town, everyone knows every, and it turned its back where once it had smiled. I remember the first time I watched one of them realize concretely that the cozy life they'd staged was dissolving. It was not dramatic, there was no cinematic breakdown. It was in the way they reread an email from their employer and then sat very still, like a man who had understood the words but not their consequence. I felt something I did not expect, a softening, like empathy reaching a place I did not know was still livable after such harm. It threatened to unspool my plan, but justice is not the same as mercy. My path was not vengeance for the sake of cruelty, it was reclamation. I had taken my power back by forcing truth to be spoken in places where it mattered, at banks, courts, employers, and the small, watching world that had once meant everything to us all. The legal filings exposed more than just the sale. They pulled at threads. Unpaid taxes hidden in a shell company, a hastily altered signature on a power of attorney, the buyer's failure to declare funding properly. Each small discovery hurt them where it counted financially and reputationally. Fines followed notices. Notices became hearings. And hearings widened the spotlight until the entire community could see the ugliness skinned beneath their polished smiles. I never wanted them jailed, I wanted restitution and recognition. I wanted them to understand, in a way that was unmistakable, the costs of their decision. The court ordered an inquiry. The bank reversed suspicious transfers pending further review. The buyer, who claimed to have been an innocent third party, found his name entangled in contracts he could not untangle. The realtor received a suspension. My pockets were not magically filled. Money is not a balm for the kind of wound they had given me. But the ledger began to even out, and that balance counted for something. It was proof that systems still work imperfectly, often slowly, but they could be bent back toward fairness. Alongside the legal campaign, I exposed the truth socially, but carefully. I shared documents with trusted journalists, local columnists who had once watched our family grow and knew how often the truth slipped between smiles at the bizarre. I told my story not as a plea for pity but as an accounting. The piece that ran in the paper was not sensationalist. It simply laid out dates, receipts, and witnesses, and it asked a question every town has asked 1,000 times. Who profits when someone else pays the price? Their names were printed in black and white beneath the headline. At first, they stormed calls, threats, and denials. Then the calls stopped. Their denial had become their admission. Friends stopped answering their messages. Neighbors stopped returning waves. The same people who had applauded their new purchases now crossed the street when they approached. When they finally confronted me, angry, broken, and loud in the grocery store aisle, I felt no triumph. I felt the slow, cool satisfaction of truth doing its work. They demanded to know how I had found the receipts, who had whispered things into the press, why my lawyer had their number. I offered no explanations they could use. I looked at them with a calm they could not rattle and told them only this, in a voice low with history: you sold what I guarded, you sold what made me who I am. You took what I gave with no thanks. I only asked for the truth. Now the truth is here. There was humiliation. Yes, there was a cracking of facades, but I made sure the punishment mirrored the Crimea public, peaceful, irrevocable. They were not ruined by a single act of cruelty, but by the slow erosion of trust that leaves even the richest pockets feeling empty. And yet, even as justice braided itself into the fabric of their lives, an unexpected tenderness kept surfacing in me, watching them stumble through consequences. I did not relish their misfortune as glee. I watched the consequences like one watches a storm pass over a familiar house, regretful of the damage, but certain that the clearing air afterward would be honest and cleaner for it. The person I had once loved existed somewhere behind the selfishness, and it pained me to see that person diminished. When restitution negotiations finally began, a small settlement that could not undo the theft but acknowledged there was a strange right of return. They paid, and the money did not bring back the laughter they had left behind. It returned a portion of what I had lost and, more importantly, gave me the leverage to step away on my own terms. The court's final order required public apology and an accounting of the transactions, both of which they issued with pale faces and muttered words. The apology did not heal everything it did, however, mark a boundary that could not be erased. I had wanted them to feel ashamed. I had wanted them to know the cost of their callousness. I had wanted to be seen. The legal victories and the social exposure did something else, too. They made me visible to myself. I was no longer the person who surrendered without a fight. I had learned to construct a defense out of evidence and dignity. I had learned that revenge could be measured, precise, and if wielded carefully and not cruel at its root. On the day the judgment was final, I walked through the empty rooms for the last time. The house smelled faintly of the mistake and of the tea I had once forgotten on the counter. I ran my fingers along the mantle where the photographs had been. I did not feel the wild joy of triumph. Instead, I felt a solid, steady peace, hard-earned and tempered by the knowledge of what it had cost. Outside, the street hummed with a life that now had fewer echoes of my past. Inside, I packed the last of my things with careful hands. I took what I needed and left what I didn't. The house's heart would beat on in another chest, in another life, and perhaps it would know gentleness. I could not control that. I could only control the steps I took from here. Revenge had been sweet, and its sweetness was not sugar but iron, a taste that steadied my hands and sharpened my vision. The poison I had brewed was not meant to kill. It was meant to clarify, to cleanse the muddy water of betrayal until it ran clear. In the end, justice had been less about watching them fall and more about watching myself stand upright again. As I closed the front door behind me, I did not slam it. I did not need to. The finality had already been delivered in the papers and the court seal. The house was no longer my fortress, but the truth I had drawn into the light belonged to me forever. When the dust of battle finally settled, I found myself standing in a life that felt both empty and wide open. The housey, the one I had sacrificed everything to Savia, was gone. The people I had trusted most had revealed themselves as strangers, their absence louder than their presence had ever been. The vengeance I had carried like a torch was finally extinguished, its flames leaving only embers of quiet strength behind. For weeks, I wandered through the motions of life like a ghost: work, sleep, eat, repeat. But something inside me had changed forever. Betrayal has a way of carving deep lines into the soul, but sometimes those lines become maps, pointing you somewhere new. One evening, I drove past the old neighborhood. The house stood there, painted fresh by its new owners, the garden tidied, the windows glowing with a life that wasn't mine anymore. For a moment, jealousy twisted in my gut, but then I realized something. The house was only ever a container. The memories it held, the sacrifices I made, the lessons I learned, those belonged to me, not to the bricks and wood. I pulled away without a tear. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had lost a home. I felt like I had left a prison. Slowly, I began building a new life. I found a modest apartment, nothing grand, but it was mine, wholly mine. No shared secrets, no whispered betrayals. I filled it with little things that made me smile: second-hand furniture with stories etched into its scratches, plants that leaned eagerly toward the sun, books stacked in uneven towers. Each object was a choice I made freely, not a relic of someone else's will. More importantly, I began to rebuild myself. I took classes I had always postponed, joined groups that welcomed me without judgment, and let new friendships blossom in spaces where I had once carried only isolation. For the first time in years, I was living for myself, not to hold together a family that had already unraveled behind my back. The bitterness didn't vanish overnight. Some nights, the betrayal still echoed through my dreams, and I woke with clenched fists and a pounding heart. But I learned to treat those memories like scars, so painful, yes, but proof of survival. Proof that I had been cut and healed, broken and rebuilt. One day, a friend asked me, "Don't you wish you could go back? Undo it all?" I thought about it, about the savings I had lost, the tears I had shed, the countless hours of despair. Then I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "If they hadn't betrayed me, I would still be there, carrying everyone else's weight, waiting for scraps of love. I would never have learned what I'm capable of, because that was the truth." The betrayal that had once shattered me had also freed me. It taught me that sacrifice without respect is slavery. That family is not defined by blood or shared walls, but by loyalty and care. That sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself. As I stood by the window of my new place one evening, watching the sunset spill gold across the sky, I realized something important. Home isn't something you save with money. It isn't something someone else can sell out from under you. Home is wherever your heart is finally safe. And mine, after everything, was finally safe again, because it belonged only to me.